The broadcast of the Minneapolis Policy and Government Oversight Committee will now begin.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Lisa Bender. I'm the chair of the Policy and Government Oversight Committee, and I'm going to call to order our regular committee meeting, which was rescheduled from yesterday afternoon to this morning to allow for us to not conflict with the services for George Floyd. I'd like to note for the record that this meeting has remote participation by council members and city staff as authorized under the Minnesota Open Meeting Law, Section 13D.021, due to the declared local public health emergency. And at this time, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll to verify the presence of a quorum.
Councilmember Reich.
Here.
Gordon.
Here.
Fletcher.
Here.
Cunningham.
Present.
Ellison.
Present.
Goodman.
Present.
Cano.
Here.
Schrader.
Here.
Johnson.
Present.
Palmisano.
Present.
Jenkins.
Here.
President Bender.
Here.
There are 12 members present.
Let the record reflect that we have a quorum. We'll begin with the consent agenda, which has 34 items today. The consent agenda I'll go ahead and read them for the record, and then please let me know, any council members, if you would like to pull any items for discussion or for more information from staff. Item 1 approves a legal settlement for workers' compensation claim of Sean Glanke. Item 2 authorizes a contract amendment with Metro Legal Services for a total revised amount not to exceed $175,000 for legal process services. Items 3 and 4 relate to this year's elections, specifically our preliminary report on plans and preparations for the primary and general elections in item number 3. And then item number 4 is a resolution which designates polling places to be used for both elections to support in-person voting on election days. I want to really thank and highlight and appreciate the partnership of both the Minneapolis School Board and the Park and Recreation Board, which very quickly helped us mobilize to identify these polling sites after the state moved forward with continuing to require us to hold in-person voting, so that we may do so in a way that's as safe as possible for the public and for our workers during the pandemic. And I can't emphasize enough how quickly they acted without any reservation with extraordinary flexibility. Item 5 has several components. First, we'll receive and file the report of the 2020 Local Board of Appeal and Equalization. And second is passage of a resolution to approve the equalization of assessed valuations of real and personal property as recommended by the local board. And finally, directing the city assessor to transmit the city's 2020 assessment rules to Hennepin County and the Minnesota Department of Revenue. Item 6 appropriates funding to support the 2020 Urban Scholars Program and accepts up to $48,250 in reimbursement for professional services and authorized contracts with partner agencies for this year's program. I'll note that staff has been working very hard and very thoughtfully to figure out how to support this program, which is a critical resource for our youth in employment, but also to do so that in a way that accommodates the realities of the pandemic. Items 7 through 21 all pertain to proposed land sales for various parcels of property in wards 4 and 5. The specific actions are setting the public hearings for each of these sales. So that would come back for the public hearing on June 18th for items 7 through 15, and the items 16 through 21 would be coming to the July 9th meeting of this committee. The details of each of those proposals is in the agenda for public reference. Items 22, 23, and 24 all pertain to contracts for work in conjunction with the city's new public service building, and those are each outlined in the agenda. You can find the details in our legislative management system. Item 25 authorizes a contract amendment with Eber Inc. for the Fire Station Number 4 Miscellaneous Improvements Project. Item 26 authorizes a grant application to be submitted to the U.S. Department of Justice for up to $900,000 for a 3-year period to develop, implement, or expand programs that respond to illicit opioids, stimulants, or other substance abuse. This is substances of abuse. This is through the health department. Item 27 sets a public hearing on June 18th to receive comments on the city's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System Stormwater Management Program and Annual Report. Item 28 authorizes the acquisition of permanent right-of-way and construction easements for Hennepin Avenue Street Reconstruction Project from Washington Avenue to 12th Street. Item 29 authorizes subordinate funding agreement for the Southwest Light Rail project in conjunction with the Metro Green Line extension. Item 30 authorizes a contract amendment not to exceed $2.4 million for CDM Smith for design and bidding services for industrial electrical rehabilitation for a new substation located at the Fridley's Water Treatment Campus. Items 31 and 32 pertain to the authorization of a common interest agreement with the Engineering and Construction Innovations Incorporated and contract amendment for a needed realignment of the water main tunnel and change in subcontractors in an amount not to exceed $18.7 million. And the passage of resolutions to issue tax-exempt bonds for the project and appropriating the additional funds to the Public Works Department for the 10th Avenue Water Main River Crossing Project. Item 33 is being referred back to staff at the request of the Public Works Department. It pertains to license agreements for the city scooter program. I want to verify that that's correct. My understanding from the agenda setting meeting that was that we were actually planning to move forward with that item today, but also I'll pause and maybe I will pull that item for later. And then our final action is the consent agenda item 34, accepting the sole bid of Werner Electrical Ventures in the amount of $1.3 million to furnish and deliver the Pump Station 5 electrical modifications for medium voltage equipment at the Fridley Water Treatment Campus, all in accordance with city specifications. So I will pause and note that I had that question on item 33, and then I will see if colleagues would like to pull any other items for discussion.
Madam President, this is Casey. Would you like me to address the issue on polling?
On item 33?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Since the agenda setting, the staff had reached out to me. There is some additional work that they would like to do to further prepare that item. So they had requested that this item be referred back to staff with anticipation that it would be quickly put back into queue.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sure I missed that communication with everything going on, so I appreciate that, Mr. Clark. Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam President. And just for the record, my camera is seemingly not working right now, so I can't turn it on. And I don't necessarily want to pull the numerous land sale items that are on the agenda. I recognize that they have been in process for a long time and just now showing up on this agenda because of our, unprecedented changes in our scheduling and the way we meet and all of those things, and that these land sales have been fully vetted with the council members of the area, and they are supportive. I just want to bring up this issue of land sales. However, given the tremendous amount of loss that we have experienced in our community, that we began to think about ways to mitigate nefarious land sales that could potentially lead to gentrification and displacement of our business owners, of our residents in really vulnerable communities like Lake Street, like Broadway, like Cedar Riverside, and other parts of town that have been challenged. And so I'm just bringing this issue up for our community planning and economic development staff, as well as our legal staff, to help us think about ways that we can be involved in what I know are private sales. However, we have to try some way to mitigate potential harm and damage of gentrification and displacement.
Okay, thank you, Vice President, for those comments. And I would also like to just point my colleagues, I believe, to an email that came out that is updating the council on the process of the work that Council Vice President referenced to kind of rethink the approach to these sales. So I want to acknowledge the comments and share that information too. Anything further on the consent agenda? Seeing none, clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Reich.
Aye.
Jordan.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Ellison,
Aye.
Goodman,
Aye.
Kano,
Aye.
Schrader,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Palmisano,
Aye.
Jenkins,
Aye.
President Bender.
Aye.
There are 12 ayes.
That carries, and the consent agenda items are adopted, with item 33 being referred back to staff as requested by the department. That brings us to our discussion items. First, we have a presentation on the city's 2020 consolidated plan, which is an action plan for COVID-19, community development block grant, and emergency solution grant supplemental funding. And we have Matt Bauer from the Intergovernmental Relations team here with the staff report. I imagine there would be also other staff involved. Thank you.
Council President Bender and members of the City Council, this is an amendment. We're requesting an amendment to the 2020 Consolidated Plan for HUD to allow us to receive supplemental community development block grant funding and emergency solutions grant funding for COVID-19 response actions in the community. I have a brief presentation here to review the programs and then review the priorities that staff are recommending to be funded through these funds, and then setting up the next steps in the process here for your information. I have other staff here to speak specifically to the project recommendations. Andrea Brennan from CPED, Mark Brenda from CPED, and Noya Woodrich from the Health Department. Next slide. So through the CARES Act, HUD has released to the City of Minneapolis $6.6 million in community development block grant funds, $3.3 million in emergency solutions grant funding. We will need to amend the current 2020 action plan that that we're currently under to allow for grant agreements to be issued by HUD to receive these funds. We had a work team over the last 6 weeks or so working on what to present to you today. And we also worked through in trying to understand, in light of any guidance that HUD has issued on how we could use these funds. And it's very clear that they need to be related to direct COVID-19 related activities of the community. Next slide. Again, we had a work group review the eligibility requirements and how these funds could be used. And you see very many departments sat on this team. Next slide, please. Back one, please. There seems to be a slide missing. So the work group reviewed the eligibility requirements of these programs, looked at what gaps are not being met by other COVID-19 related resources that might be available to the city, considered the City Council direction to center any COVID-19 response on race equity, and to try to achieve opportunities for great impact and service to low income Black, Indigenous, and persons of color communities. Next slide. So briefly, this is a real high-level overview of the staff recommended funding priorities. I'd like to ask that questions be held to after the presentation, and we can have staff get into further detail on these recommended priorities. But within the health department, we are recommending building capacity for kind of a health emergency response ability and support of our safety net clinics. The next slide, please. Within CPED, some housing programming for CDBG, both with addressing homelessness issues as well as renter issues and home ownership issues and dislocated worker training issues. Next slide, please. With the Emergency Solutions Grant, we are proposing additional homelessness response actions, expanding shelter capacity, working to supplement existing and new efforts in street outreach to serve unsheltered persons, and then some back office functions to allow for support of our community partners in terms of administration and kind of accountability for these funds. Next slide, please. So with COVID funds, HUD has asked, or in order to get the funds out the door as soon as we can, they have reduced the public comment period on any amendments to our consolidated plan from 30 days to 5 days. It is scheduled that this comment period on these actions that you may be taking today would run the week following council approval. And for purposes of the CDBG funds, there is also a public hearing required, and that will be held during that same comment period. And we envision that on the current schedule as being the June 18th City Council meeting. Next slide. I believe that's it. Yes. So to stand for any questions, if you could get the slide back to the health department recommendations. Yes. I would open it up for any questions. And we have staff here from CPED and the health departments to answer any questions on these programming recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Do council members have any questions on the presentation and recommendations from staff? Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam President. I do have a question around the health department proposals. I know that I've been a part of the Shared Power Advisory Committee, which is a committee of city residents, BIPOC community members who are helping to shape the city's response to the COVID-19 crisis and really helping identify gaps within communities of color. And one of the things that they have been working on is a BIPOC report. And I'm wondering, are there resources dedicated to the development and distribution of that report? And that might be a question for Commissioner Musicant.
Yes, if Commissioner Musicant is on, could speak. Also, we have Noya Woodrich who could speak to this issue. Thanks.
Great. Commissioner Musicant, Health Department. Council Vice President Jenkins, thank you for the question. No, I don't believe that we have identified specific resources for following through on the recommendations that we expect to come out of the advisory group. Many of those recommendations appear to be focused on what kind of data can we collect and how can we look even beyond health data to see the impact of COVID-19 on our communities. We are planning to bring forward those recommendations along with the committee in 2 weeks period. And I think it'll be an opportunity for us to think as an enterprise, what can we pull together from data that we already have, and then where will we need to look for additional resources to build more capacity to monitor some of the things that they're identifying. We as a health department are currently looking at what we can do that is recommended already within our capacity and resources, but no specific designation for follow through on the recommendations has not been identified yet.
And if I may follow up, Madam President, so the question was more directed to the development and printing and distribution of the report that this committee is putting together. I'm taking it that there's no resources committed to that process yet either.
Madam Vice President, I think we will be able to manage creating and distributing the recommendations within our current resources.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments in response to the staff recommendations, or I'll welcome a motion on this item as well? Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam President. If we could turn to the next slide. Go back one, please. So I wanted to ask about the emergency housing assistance for clarification. So for the just for the clarification, is that specifically for, and this is for Director Frank if he's on the line, is that specifically for rental, or is that emergency housing assistance for both renters and homeowners?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Cunningham, David Frank from CPED. I think that I see our housing director, Andrea Brennan, is on the call, and I think she's better positioned, having been involved in this, if she can take the question.
Yes, thank you. Andrea Brennan, Director of Housing Policy and Development in CPED. Madam President, Councilmember Cunningham, the proposed up to $2 million for emergency housing assistance is intended to continue to fill the gap in emergency housing assistance. And as we all know, the initial housing assistance provided by the city was for rental assistance only. At this time, we have identified that there may be potential need to also serve low and moderate income homeowners with their mortgage payments. As you can see, also recommended here, the third item here is $300,000 to expand foreclosure prevention counseling for low income homeowners through our existing contract with the Minnesota Homeownership Center. So the idea is that if we bring forward a request to the council for additional emergency housing assistance, we will be evaluating at that time based on what we're hearing from Minnesota Homeownership Center about the need for emergency mortgage assistance in addition to rental assistance. What we understand right now is that the majority of people who have been impacted, at least by the COVID-19 crisis, do have options available to them for forbearance. There's a possibility that there are some folks that don't have that option, and so we absolutely will be exploring that. And to the extent we think that there are homeowners out there that need relief, then we will be recommending emergency housing assistance that serves both renters and low-income homeowners, but only the low-income homeowners who do not have forbearance as an option. But we do expect that to be a gap, although a relatively small gap, but still a gap. And that is something that we will consider bringing forward. I also want to say that We are not bringing forward the actual program right now at this time because there are additional emergency housing assistance programs that are coming online. Hennepin County just released another $15 million for emergency housing assistance. That's for renter only. And we understand that the state is preparing a new emergency housing assistance program that would be for both renters and homeowners. So we're carefully watching what other resources are out there, where there are gaps, and we expect that if we do bring forward a program, it's likely to include a recommendation to include serving those low-income homeowners who are not eligible for forbearance.
Thank you, Madam President, if I may.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Director Brennan. I really appreciate the additional information. As you know, but again, I want to just make sure I'm stating for the public record, this is something that I've been strongly advocating for. In North Minneapolis, we see an interesting dynamic where from the 2008 foreclosure crisis, we had a lot of large companies, real estate companies and speculators buy up large swaths of the housing stock and then turn it into rather low quality single family home rentals that in some cases the rent is more than double what the mortgage would cost if they owned the house themselves. And so we have an interesting dynamic here. I say interesting in the Minnesotan way, in that it's not good that we have a dynamic where actually home ownership in many cases is actually more affordable than renting here. And so as we're thinking about equity, as you said, this is not necessarily going to be a large need, right? It's not like we're going to see this expansive swath of folks, but I would say that the folks who have come and talked to me about these issues have largely been Black women. And so I want to make sure that when we're thinking about equity, when we're thinking about housing stability, that we're thinking about the folks who are homeowners that are cash poor or low wealth, and how are we making sure that we are putting all of the parameters that are necessary in place to make sure that we are preventing another foreclosure crisis. So thank you. I love, you know me, I love data. So I'm glad that we'll be working with the Minnesota Homeownership Center so that we can gather the data to be able to see where can we make investments where they will be most impactful. So thank you so much for that information. And thank you, Madam President, for letting me ask the question.
Yes, thank you. And Councilmember, I was going to chime in because I know how much you love data, and just say, and Andrea or Ms. Brennan, please chime in if you'd like to as well. But staff really took a very data-driven approach to this as quickly as they could with the data available, and that's how they identified, the particular gaps versus, understanding that the number of folks who are impacted by this upcoming crisis, because they don't have federally backed mortgages, is likely much lower is much lower than it was in the last foreclosure crisis. But to your point, we were able to get data from the federal government about which rental properties in our city are federally backed for larger apartment buildings that are 5+ units. But for the thousands and thousands of units that are smaller rental properties, 1 to 4 units, many of which are locally owned or even owner occupied duplexes, for example, that may have 1 rental unit as well. We haven't been able to get that specific data. So staff did send out a communication to all rental property owners in the city, giving them information about how they can look up if their property is federally backed so that they can take advantage of forbearance opportunities available from the federal government or even from their own private lenders. But those federally backed properties also have protections for renters in them as well. So, we've been trying to get more of that data for the smaller apartment buildings, also knowing that those, again, tend to be owner occupied, tend to be locally owned by what are essentially very small business owners in our city. So I think the data-driven approach has been really appreciated so far, and I think there's lots of support to continue in that vein as well. Councilmember Schrader.
Thank you, Council President. I wanted to follow up on that, Director Brennan. I really appreciate all the things the city is doing to just help folks and to really come up with new kind of financial tools. But I kind of want to get a lay of the land. Are we seeing more financial tools to address the issues Councilmember Cunningham has brought up, kind of that we're seeing in a lot of different variations throughout the city? Are banks stepping up? Are financial partners stepping up? Are we seeing this on the private market?
Madam President, Councilmember Schrader, yes, we are seeing private lenders step up and offer forbearance options to homeowners beyond those that are required to because they are backed by federal insurance. So we are seeing that. However, there are some lenders who are not providing for forbearance options. And so that's where there is a gap. The good news in this scenario is that after the foreclosure crisis, the percentage of our overall loans that are subprime loans or maybe potentially sort of in the predatory loan category is a much smaller percentage than what we saw going into the 2008 foreclosure crisis. So back then it was, 10% plus. And now the Minnesota Homeownership Center estimates that it's in the 1% sort of area. But still, that amounts to a fair number of potential homeowners who may need assistance. So we are watching that, and we will be bringing forward recommendations for assistance if to the extent we see a need there.
Oh, fantastic, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments on this item? Or again, I'll welcome a motion for this discussion item.
So moved, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Council Vice President has moved the item. Is there any further discussion? Thank you both. Seeing none, clerk will call the roll.
Councilmember Reich.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Fletcher. Councilmember Fletcher.
Aye.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Cano.
Aye.
Schrader.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Jenkins.
Aye.
President Bender.
Aye.
There are 12 ayes.
That carries, and that item will be forwarded to the full City Council meeting next Friday, a week from today. Our second presentation today is from our Health Department, and it will provide a status on the impact of COVID-19 in our community, and we have Commissioner Musicant here to lead that staff presentation. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam President. We're going to be talking about a number of items under this update. We're going to talk about what are some of the impacted populations. You can go to the next slide already. Thanks. The community response that we are engaging in and testing. Also the work that we have begun to do over the last few weeks on case investigation and contact tracing and the isolation and quarantine that goes with that. And then per your request, talking about the division of responsibilities between city, county, and state in our response. So I want to start by saying that the homicide of George Floyd and the protests that resulted from that have really intersected in a very meaningful way with the work that we are concerned about related to COVID-19. And so during this period of time, we have focused on the safety of protesters. We have been able to distribute nearly 50,000 masks to protesters to make sure that the likelihood of spreading COVID-19 was diminished, and really saw a remarkable adoption of the use of masks during this very tense time. It was heartwarming to see people able to incorporate that at a time when they were thinking about many other things. We're also very attentive to, let's see, I think we can go to the next. Oh no, we're on the right one. I'm sorry. The community trauma, very attentive to that. We've been leveraging the relationships that we have because of the Office of Violence Prevention, as well as the community engagement work that we have incorporated into our response all along. Working through outreach teams. Our staff have been both as part of their work and response involved in supporting protesters and cleanup, and then also as individuals on their own time. And we are also deeply connected to the work that is connected to food insecurity needs that have really increased because of some of the changes at the community level, and have developed resource information and are trying to help lift up opportunities to access food. In terms of mental well-being and resilience, we have worked closely with RECAST and neighborhood and community relations and community partners to be attentive to learn about, and to support efforts to lift up folks in those areas. And then there's a lot of uncertainty about will we see increased cases. In response to that, the State Health Department has been working with us to create testing opportunities. There'll be 4 testing opportunities that will be generally available to the community. I'll tell you about that in just a second. But they have also changed their guidance to healthcare providers. And so in the past, the providers were told that if someone had symptoms, or if they worked in a healthcare setting, or if they were in a congregate care setting, then they had good rationale to receive a test. The State Health Department has added to that anyone who has been involved in any of these large community events that we have had in the last few days is also quote unquote eligible or appropriate to receive testing through their provider. And so that has opened up opportunities for testing across the board as people go to their providers. In addition to that, there will be, starting next week and for 3 weeks, there will be 4 locations. 3 of them south, 1 north, that will operate at least 2 days a week. And this will be done in collaboration with community clinics and other community providers. It will not be something like we saw at the Armory Northeast, where the National Guard was involved. We didn't think that was appropriate at this time. So the locations that have been identified so far are 1 at Sabathani, 1 is at the Native American Community Clinic, 1 is at New Salem Baptist Church, and then they are still working with a couple of locations that are very close to the 3rd precinct and haven't yet landed on that.
Food, can you hear me?
So let me turn now some of the
Excuse me, we're getting some interruption of the commissioner's presentation. I just want to make sure everyone's microphones are muted. If you're not, Commissioner Musican.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The numbers that I'm sharing with you today are from a little bit earlier this week as we prepared the PowerPoint. And so you can see that there have been an increase in cases in Minneapolis over time. The last week is a little less certain because there's a lag in when we get the results of tests. So the solid line is the most dependable piece of data. So currently we've had almost 3,500 total cases, 3,402 cases, and of those 552 have been hospitalized and 137 have died.
Thank you, Commissioner. And we have a question from Council Vice President Jenkins.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Madam President and Commissioner Musican. Did you name the South Side locations yet, or did I miss those?
Yes, I did, but I will gladly repeat them. Sabathani is 1, and the Native American Community Clinic is the 2nd, and then they are looking for a location close to the 3rd precinct, and there are just a couple entities that are still in the mix and they haven't decided between the two options that they have.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the report, and I also appreciate you stressing that we can't necessarily think the reporting of the recent days are accurate, but I see more of a leveling off there. And we're all looking for a leveling off. Are you seeing that? Are you anticipating that that's just when those numbers change, they're going to keep the steep slope up?
Thank you for that question, Councilmember Gordon, and Madam Chair, for your permission. I also noticed that and hope that it remains as we see it before us, but we will have to wait and see. The state is seeing some positive turning of the peak. And so I'm hoping that because we are contributing a significant amount to the statewide numbers, that our numbers are also doing that. But we will have to wait and see. It does give us some sense of hope, but we'll see if that is well placed. So the next slide. When we talk about who is most at risk, I'm going to show you some subsequent slides now that look at some of the case demographics. And so we look at cases, but then we also need to look at mortality and location by neighborhood as well. And so I will show you slides in that regard. So this first one, the light colors are the estimated percent of our city population for that category. So you'll see for the white population, 64% of the population is considered white, and 23% of the cases that have been identified are white. You'll see that in the black category that the darker blue is larger than the lighter blue. So there is a higher percentage of Black people who have been identified with positive cases than the number of people in our community, or the percentage in our community. And when we look over to the green slide, the same can be said for the Hispanic category, that while 10% of the population is in that category, 27% of the cases are identified as Hispanic. And when we look at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that for ages 55 and above, there is a higher percent of people with positive COVID cases than their representation in the community. And I'm just going to say now, because you'll see this unknown show up on this page, and then a couple more that I'm going to show you. Unknown has got two things going on in it. One is people who didn't want to give us any information in this realm, and two, people who we have not yet had an opportunity to fully interview, but we have their test results. So it's subject to some change over time. Next slide, please. So this slide talks about what kind of exposure people had, or where they likely picked up COVID-19. And I'd like to point out that 12% of the cases, and this is cases, not mortality. You'll see a difference when we look at mortality. 12% of the cases were picked up in long-term care facilities. Let's go to the next slide, which is the mortality focus. So of those who are positive for COVID-19, then what are the characteristics of those who unfortunately died because of that infection? So let's look at the Black category. And we remember, if you remember from earlier slide, 33% of the cases were in this category, and yet 14% of the deaths are in this category. And the Black population census estimates are 19% of the population. So in some ways, there is something positive happening there. It is likely to be because many of the cases in Minneapolis and across the state are, the mortality cases are in long-term care. And that tends to be a whiter population. And so it affects the percentages. So the same.
Commissioner.
Yes.
Sorry, Council Vice President has a question.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam President. I don't have a question, Commissioner. I just wanted to note that the dual aspects of racism and the coronavirus was present in, unfortunately present in Mr. Floyd's life and death, as he was also tested positive for coronavirus.
Council Vice President, thank you. I did not know that. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, stop me up there. So, and then you will notice when we look at the ages of the mortality statistics that very high percentage are over 75. Next slide, please. So,
Commissioner, I'm sorry to interrupt, and I may have missed this if you said it earlier. Have you spoken? I was dealing with a little technical issue here. Have you spoken to the specific impacts in our Somali American community in Minneapolis, and could you help us understand how that shows up both in the data and our approach?
Yes, thank you, Madam President. I am going to touch on the East African community a little bit more in the presentation. Right now, though, the Black category includes, of course, African American folks and people who are East African immigrants. And we've had to use some other mechanisms to figure out just how significant the burden is in each of those communities. And so I'll talk a little bit more about, in our contact tracing, some of the languages spoken that help demonstrate both Spanish speaking and East African language speaking folks and how they are represented in the cases. And then I will also talk about some of the specific work we've done to address testing in the Cedar Riverside area.
Thank you.
So looking at this slide, I need to look back and remind myself what the percentage of cases that were exposed in long-term care, but I think it was 12% or something like that. And you'll see that amongst the mortality that 79% of those who have are living in long-term care and were likely exposed in a congregate living setting. Next slide, please. We are now able to show you more detail about where cases are as we have larger numbers. And so there are 8 neighborhoods that have over 100 cases. One of them is in North Minneapolis and 7 are in South Minneapolis. And then there are several others that have between 80 and 100 cases in those same areas. Next slide, please. So as we go about our work, we're paying particular attention to BIPOC residents, focusing on African American and East African populations in particular, as well as the unsheltered homeless. And because of the location of many of folks in the East African community living in the Cedar Riverside area, that is a focus. And we are also working with long-term care and congregate living throughout the city and public housing because of the concentrated nature of those living environments. And by concentrating, what are we doing? We're doing community outreach, reaching into those communities to make sure the clear understanding of needs, doing testing planning, and then there's a great deal of consultation and education, helping businesses, helping residences, helping long-term care facilities work with the parameters that we know are effective and get the resources that they need in order to help people keep from the virus if it is present in their locations. So next is community engagement, and this has been a focus from the very start. When we set up our incident management team using international and nationally known ways of organizing emergency response, we did something new. We created a community engagement branch. Just based on our experience with other emergencies, we recognize that often your first focus is on physical needs and the engagement of the community is so powerful and so important in understanding those needs and in meeting them that we started right from the start to have this community engagement branch, and it has served us well. We have been in partnership with neighborhood and community relations, and we also created under our community engagement branch, you heard Council Vice President Jenkins speak already a bit about them, but the Shared Power Advisory Committee, and they are in the process of developing a BIPOC impact assessment, which we hope they will be ready to share with you in 2 weeks. We are also working hand in glove with community organizations. We have some existing memorandums of understanding with several organizations, but have expanded that beyond those formalized relationships and are working as closely as we can to help community organizations continue to operate and then help them also reach out and be part of sharing the messages and sharing the resources like masks and hand sanitizer and other supports, including thermometers. We are also trying to pay attention to communications, both in how we communicate and also who messages come from, because we know that there is value in having trusted relationships and hearing from people who are trusted in community. And so we're focusing linguistically and culturally specific ways of communicating. We've done a lot of mask distribution, cloth mask distribution, as well as surgical masks and to some degree N95s, especially for healthcare settings. And then we have also worked closely through our regulatory relationship to support food establishments as they restaurants think about reopening, but corner stores and grocery stores that have been operating on an ongoing basis, trying to help them figure out how to do that in the safest manner for both their workers and the public. Next slide, please. So testing is now more available and growing more available and is so important as we reopen many of our constraints that we have placed on ourselves, that we have broader testing, and what goes with that is contact tracing as well. So to date, our role has been to coordinate between communities, healthcare systems, and the state for community-based testing. There was a National Guard testing over the Memorial weekend, and they were able to test 2,895 folks and there was a 5.73% positive. So 166 people had positive tests, and 5% of the population that was tested, over 5%, was positive. We are also working with long-term care. The National Guard is available to help long-term care settings test all staff and residents. And so we're working to get that information out to long-term care settings and help them make those arrangements. We have also been working for quite some time in the Cedar Riverside area to improve access to testing. And we believe that our work there in that neighborhood will help us get a better handle on what model works to get things to happen. So I'll start with the Cedar Riverside Public Housing building. We've worked with M Health, and they have been able to go and test all of their members, so people that are clients or patients of theirs already. They have done that testing, and then beginning next week, it was going to happen this week, but we put it off because of all the things going on in the community. Kook Clinic will be offering testing to anyone else in that building, whether or not they are a patient of Kook Clinic. And so we'll be doing both outreach about that testing and the testing itself next week. We are working with Hennepin Health to do testing in the Sherman properties, and we'll be doing pre-registration and testing next week as well. The State Health Department is also working on coordinating testing in response to the civil unrest, and I mentioned those sites at the beginning of this presentation. So on to case investigation and contact tracing, which is closely tied with increased testing. Then you have the need to contact more people and give them advice about how to isolate themselves or keep from sharing their infection with others. So we have ramped up our team.
Excuse me, Commissioner.
Yes.
Councilmember Schrader has a comment or question.
Okay.
Thank you, Council President. Commissioner Muscant, first of all, thank you for all you and your staff are doing in this crisis. I had a question about those giving the tests. I just kind of wanted to check in their access to testing. Like, the community owes them a deep debt of gratitude for putting themselves out there to really help out. But I want to make sure even those that are covered with insurance, would they still have to pay a copay? Like, is there a cost involved to themselves, to the workers themselves getting testing?
Thank you, Madam Chair, Councilmember Schroeder. I didn't hear the very first words you asked. So who in particular were you asking about?
Oh, in particular, those giving the test, all of the frontline workers, all those that are there. I think we're talking about the community at large, but I want to make sure that those that are stepping up to really help are getting the same accesses to service, and also making sure that those costs are covered.
Thank you. I have been trying to make sure that I understand with certainty just what the parameters of payment are for tests. And I would say that I'm 75% sure of my answer. I know that there's a federal regulation that people cannot be charged a co-payment. And now that we have the guidance from the State Health Department that includes both people that were involved in the protests, but also those who are healthcare providers, which I think anyone doing testing would be included in that category, have symptoms or are in long-term care, are all eligible for testing. That should clear the way for health insurance to pay entirely. I'm sure there will be cases where the health insurance companies are still figuring out what parameters they're supposed to live under, and so we'll need to help give people the information that they need in order to make the system work as it should be working. I am also making sure that I know about the cost implications for the public testing that is going to be offered that I mentioned in both South Minneapolis and North Minneapolis, and I believe those tests will be free to those who seek them, and that could include, if they're interested, those who are working at the testing site.
Okay, thank you.
So this area, as I said, contact or case investigation, contact tracing is very closely tied to testing. We have ramped up now, and 25% of our health department staff are now trained and are doing case investigation and contact tracing, and we're doing that 7 days a week. And we are going to be training an additional 18 people, both from the enterprise and 3 urban scholars starting next week. We will need to shift some of our capacity because some of our staff who are doing the contact tracing are also food, lodging, and pools inspectors. And so as those businesses begin to open, they will need to pivot and do that work rather than contact tracing. But we think we will have a team of about 30 that can rotate in and out, and so provide this service for Minneapolis residents. Today,
what is the funding source for those staff positions? Is it city funding, or are we able to use any grant funds we've received from other sources?
Thank you for that question, Madam Chair. There are promises that we hear from the state, both in terms of some of the federal dollars that they have gotten, and perhaps some yet unidentified state dollars. We don't have anything in our hands or clearly identified to pay for these services at this point. We are still hopeful that in the very near future, maybe with a special session, that there will be a clearer route to reimburse for those folks who have already done this work and for those doing the work going forward.
Thank you.
So to date, we have interviewed 787 cases in 26 days, and that's about 30 a day. The interviews vary from 20 minutes to a couple hours, depending on how complex they are, the number of positive individuals in the household, and the use of the language line. So of those cases that we've interacted with, 43% have been conducted in a language other than English. So this begins to show us the proportion of cases that might be East African or Hispanic. And so of those 43%, 74% of those folks needed Spanish interpreters, and then 22% needed Somali interpreters. So that begins to give us a little window into how some of the categories are shaking out in terms of the demographics of the cases. The state is planning to transition to a regional hub, and in doing so, there would be the metro region. We would still be contributing our city folks, but when we have peaks and valleys, we would be able to help each other out. And they believe that using this regional hub, they would be able to access quite a number of additional hours of case investigation and contact tracing. And hopefully that will be something that comes to fruition in the month of June. Isolation and quarantine. So part of what comes with contact tracing is then giving people advice about how to isolate themselves if they are ill, to keep themselves from infecting others, and if they're not infected but have been exposed to someone who's in, or they don't have a positive test, have been exposed to someone who has a positive test, then we call that quarantine, and we ask them to stay away from others. So if they become COVID positive but aren't symptomatic, they still will not be sharing the virus. So we are working hand in glove with the county. The county supplies housing for people experiencing homelessness, and there is detailed guidance for the contact tracers as they work with families and communicate with those residents about how to accomplish isolation and quarantine in their home. depending on how many bathrooms they have access to, we give them advice about not sharing a bathroom or how to clean the bathroom if sharing is needed, how to find a space within a home to be away from others in the home if that's possible. If there are healthy folks in the home, perhaps they could go live with relatives or friends for a select period of time. So we really problem solve all of those options with people to create the safest possible environment. And Hennepin County is under contract with the Minneapolis Health Department to provide essential services support. So as we ask people to stay home, they need help figuring out, well, how am I going to replenish the medication that I would normally go to the store and get, or where is the source of food if I'm not able to go out and shop for it. So those are the kinds of supports that the county helps with, and we've also been tapping into community organizations as well. I'm nearing the end. The next one is jurisdictional coordination. And so the Minneapolis Health Department is really in charge of the local response. And our response is based on the needs that are identified and then our capacity to respond. And if we don't have the capacity, finding others who can augment our capacity.
Commissioner, I'm sorry, Councilmember Cunningham was in queue and I missed his message. Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Commissioner. The question I want to ask was around the other languages that the interviews are taking place in. Who do we have folks who are available to be able to do the interviews in Hmong? And have we seen the Hmong community engaged, or Southeast Asia community at large engaged in this work?
Madam Chair, Council Member Cunningham, that's a great question. I think I'm going to have to get back to you in terms of the language in the case investigation and the frequency of that language. The statistics show us that it's a relatively small impact in terms of numbers to date, but I will get more information for you. And we definitely are trying to have case investigation done by people who are able to speak those other languages themselves rather than use the language line, if possible. Because we know that leads to better communication and a better interview and probably is a faster interview. But we are using the language line when we're not able to do that. But I will get back to you on the number of cases that are needing either someone who speaks Hmong or the language line for that language.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure to name that language need as well, and just make sure that we have the capacity to be able to address that. I know that in the grand scheme of the numbers, that we're not seeing a huge number of folks in the Asian community at large being identified as being positive for COVID, but I just want to make sure that we do have the capacity, even if it's at a smaller scale, to be able to address that need. So thank you so much.
Yes. I'm getting a text from my epidemiologist who says that, yes, we have access to Hmong interviewers and we have had some interviews in the Hmong language. So great. Thank you for that question.
That is expeditious service. I appreciate it.
And someone's watching us and answering things. Yes. Let me see. So we have focused in Minneapolis, as I've already described, on case investigation and contact tracing, working to reduce the spread of COVID-19 and the amount of consultation. I cannot be overemphasized. There's just, because of the great uncertainty with this infection and having learning as a community, as a country, as a world about this infection. There's just so much need for consultation and advice and helping people keep up with the latest governor's order or emergency order from the city. And so really the consultation has been very, very significant. And then community engagement has been a priority for us, and along with that goes communications and greater and greater productivity on the testing. There's been interest in testing for some time, but we're I think getting our feet under ourselves and making some progress there finally. Hennepin County, their main roles when it comes to Minneapolis have been providing the isolation and quarantine housing for those experiencing homelessness, and then providing essential services support for anyone in isolation. The state is really leading the epidemiology guidance for local public health, and so we're working hand in glove with them and implementing directions that come from them. The state EOC is leading the planning for testing and morgue capacity building and healthcare capacity building, and is now also coordinating the PPE supplies. There is a state health care coordination center, which is part of the state EOC, and they are planning and managing the need for inpatient, long-term care, and alternative care sites. Many of these responsibilities have been evolving in their clarity as we see what the needs are. So in summary, our epidemiologic response has really focused on the case investigation and the contact tracing. Tactically, we are trying to get testing to happen and coordinate the testing, working with long-term care and helping them case manage situations as they arise in long-term care. Really working closely with restaurants and other businesses to make sure that they have in place the kinds of ways of operating that are going to cut down on transmission. Also heavily focusing on public and multifamily housing supports because we know of the potential for the virus spread in those environments. And then also focusing on the population of people who are homeless. In terms of data, we're looking at the epi data, which is pretty much what I shared here, but also listening to the community and collecting information from the community as they see needs arise. And as we have spoken of a bit already, the Shared Power Advisory Committee is putting together a race and equity impact assessment that will be shared with you. We are combining both our operations and our community engagement to make sure that we are engaging with communities in a community and cultural case management approach. And so we're looking at needs in the community, both from a setting perspective, from a population perspective, from a function perspective, however people are organized and the disease seems to be making itself evident, or concern about the spread of the disease making it evident. We are trying to organize in those ways that make sense based on the community. And I've already spoken about the Shared Power Advisory Committee. So looking forward, we just received yesterday, I believe, an additional 50,000 masks from the State Health Department. And so we will be getting those out into the community organizations as quickly as possible, congregate care settings, high-rise residences. We are concerned about the ongoing trauma of just having dealt with all the isolation that is created by COVID-19, and then on top of that, all of the things that have happened in our community in the last week and a half. And we have a community well-being unit, a community mental well-being unit that is moving from a planning stage to an implementation stage. And so we'll be having more discrete activities around that. We are also working with communications on creating more of a campaign. There are many excellent efforts to communicate, and we believe that if we can combine those efforts under a campaign, that we can amplify the impact of information's getting out into the community. And as I've said all along throughout this presentation, more testing, the isolation and quarantine that goes with that. And then someday, eventually, hopefully not as long as some people say, we will have some vaccine, and we will need to think about how to distribute that, how to communicate about its availability, how to make sure that communities understand that it's for them and they are able to access it. So already we are beginning to think about, even though there is no vaccine in the near future, but we're already beginning to think about how do we have a system of distribution so that everyone has fair and equitable access to it. And that is the end of my presentation, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Council Vice President.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Commissioner Musikant, for that very comprehensive report. And thank you and your staff for all the work that you have been doing throughout these very, very enormously trying times. I'm wondering if can you mention the 8 neighborhoods, 7 of which are in South Minneapolis, that have more than 100 cases?
Madam Chair, Council Vice President, you are testing my knowledge of of the map. I'm not sure that I will be able to accurately say which neighborhoods they are. They are the ones in the darkest coloration on the map, which was on slide 10. I can certainly send you an email.
Phillips neighborhoods in South Minneapolis. Central neighborhood. I believe Powderhorn neighborhood.
Cedar Riverside.
And Cedar Riverside, yeah.
Whittier, Lindale, Stevens Square, maybe.
I think it's just important for our residents, particularly of those neighborhoods, to just be aware of the, you know, the concern and, you know, the messaging to be safe, to wear the mask, to wash your hands, to do the things that are necessary to keep people safe.
You know, one thing to note, Council Vice President, I agree, is also to see if there's a way to look at this data that also acknowledges the population density differences in our city neighborhoods. So this map looks very familiar if you looked at a map of population density of our city. Yes. So not to say that residents of these neighborhoods shouldn't be concerned, but it might be helpful to put that into context about, is there a heightened risk in these neighborhoods, or is this just reflecting the population density distribution? And probably both things are true, but I just wanted to note that piece of the data because I think this is neutral to population density.
Fair point.
Yeah, yes, you're correct. Madam Chair, my staff are great at texting me, and so I can actually name the neighborhoods now for you for the record. So as it is Cedar Riverside, Central, Ventura Village, Powderhorn, Willard Hay, Whittier, Phillips West, and Midtown Phillips. This is a reflection of where people live. They were not necessarily exposed where they live. They could be. Some of the exposures might be connected to their work. So those are just some additional caveats.
Thank you. I see Councilmember
Thank
Gordon.
you so much, Commissioner. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. And I don't have a question. I just wanted to take the opportunity to, I guess, echo what Council Vice President was saying about the deep gratitude I think that I think the whole council feels, and the people of Minneapolis, and certainly I feel, and not gratitude, but also comfort, just knowing that you, and especially and including all the staff, are working so hard now and have been working so hard, especially during these very challenging and trying days, just to know that each of us is not alone, but each of us is part of a much larger number that is all they're trying to help and trying to make a difference, and the health department is so valued right now, and I think appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. I have a meeting with staff later today, and I will share that with them.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments on the Commissioner's report? I don't see any, so again, just echoing Council Vice President's thanks, and the rest of my colleagues as well who've spoken, to your staff who are going so above and beyond, again, as we know, with very limited resources coming in for this specific task. So it's just so deeply appreciated, and we really hope our partners will continue to support the city. I know we've gotten a lot of partnership support, but that financial support is also desperately needed, which is the topic of our next item. So unless there's anything further, I will direct the clerk to receive and file this report and then move on to the next item. So we do have two additional pieces of business that were not submitted in time for the printed agenda, but one is a presentation from staff led by Director Frank from our Community Planning and Economic Development Department, as well as our Intergovernmental Relations staff, on some initial estimates about the damages and costs we've seen in our city over the past week, as well as Emergency Management Director Barrett Lane. So I'll turn it over to that staff team to help us understand both some of the damage and economic impact we've seen in our community, and then some potential avenues for support.
Thank you, Madam President. Committee members, David Frank from CPED, thank you for the time to spend a few minutes this morning telling you about the approach and the strategy and some early information citywide in the damage that we have seen in the last week. So first, an overview. I think it's important to note that a very long-standing system produced these results. And by results, I mean damage to people, to buildings. And it will require a long-term commitment to solve it. We need to be thinking as we try each day about who we are serving and how our actions will impact the lives of the people we are serving, and who is in the room to make the decisions and design our strategies. The healing and the recovery from the damage can't be business as usual. We cannot dust off what we have done in the past as the basis for our future actions, or we will get the same results, and we shouldn't be surprised when we do. Quick action, as tempting as it is, will also reinforce the existing decision-making structure, and that structure has underrepresented Black and Brown voices and their lived experiences. And as frustrating as it is, even for me, quantifying losses will take time. And I want to underline the definitions here, right? So I'll tell you a little bit more later about bricks and mortar building damage, but also about people's economic wealth lost. And we should all be clear that what is happening right now is very likely going to increase the wealth gap for our BIPOC community and intensification of displacement pressures, to the Council Vice President's point a few minutes ago, throughout Minneapolis. Here is how we are starting to think about our strategy. We need to focus on people instead of buildings. We should continue to change the conversation from buildings to people, and the cost of recovery from bricks and mortar to lost wealth in our communities of color. We need to identify who we are serving. We should be intentional and explicit about who we are serving and how those we are serving define their own needs. We need to put impacted people at the table. We need to set up a system of decision-making that includes participation and agency of BIPOC and particularly Black staff and community in the design and decision-making process. We need to amass unrestricted and flexible funding. We should advocate for substantial, unrestricted local and external aid in excess of $500 million and maybe much more to address the damages, the stabilization of surrounding neighborhoods, and addressing the root causes of our inequities. Again, to the Council Vice President's point, we should come up with strategies to prevent displacement. We should consider moratoriums against evictions and foreclosures in the city until our recovery plan is created and in place. We should make decisions with people. We should not announce any specific recovery programs or details outside of an inclusive decision-making process. And we should be on the ground now. We should support continued resources to our culturally competent technical assistance providers to provide immediate support to the people and businesses directly impacted by the riots. So as we turn towards recovery, assessing true losses is a complex process taking time and city resources and partner resources. Damage value estimates will start low and they will have a large margin of error. We are working across the enterprise and with policymakers and with people impacted and with community-based groups to assess losses. And in partnership with community and with more time, we will get to more refined numbers. There's immediate support today on the ground through community-based organizations in our business technical assistance program and our Great Streets partners. And we are working with them to identify and coordinate rebuilding and other resources, much like we did, feels like weeks ago now, when we were working to plan our business reopenings. So let me tell you about the 3 ways that we are categorizing the damages that we need to address. Number 1, observable damage. And by that, I largely mean physical building damage. Led by our Office of Emergency Management, we did a damage assessment process. We sent 17 teams to assign geographies throughout the city with grids to map the entire city to evaluate structural damage using FEMA's defined levels of affected, minor, major, and destroyed. They were all in the field this Wednesday and Thursday, 1 driver and 1 form filler with as many COVID precautions as they could take. And this consisted of teams from CPED and Public Works and Reg Services and the Park Board. They went along all streets throughout the city as possible, and they evaluated damage to any structures, public, private, residential, and commercial. And I'm speaking of structures, not right-of-way. The teams used an application developed by our IT department, and the data will be used by multiple departments and in a variety of ways to get a firmer understanding of the building damage and to begin the recovery process for buildings. Our inspectors have told us that 11 buildings and counting must be demolished for public safety. These demolitions have been delayed by the need to make sure that utilities are disconnected. Centerpoint, for instance, has to pressure test one of their main lines, and then they can move ahead with turning off the gas for demolitions and on the gas for individual properties. They're expecting that that will be tomorrow. And we are also working with some building owners who are pursuing demolitions of their property, and these are also held up until the utility issues are resolved. We have been telling owners, property owners, to do what's necessary to make things safe, and we've also circulated guidance to the public to be safe around damaged buildings. We continue to move from crowdsourced reports to city assessed and verified information about property damage. And as of now, we can update the magnitude of property damage, again, to buildings alone, to at least 2 or 3 times what we knew as of Monday. You'll remember that that was a $55 million number. We now believe we are at 2 or 3 times that at least. So at least 100 million to 150 million citywide. And this number will certainly continue to increase in the coming days. Let me tell you about business losses.
Mr. Frank, we have a question or comment from Council Vice President, and I know you have more to your presentation as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. And I know we have limited time, and I'm sure there's much more to your presentation, Director Frank. I do want to just initially state, wow, the analysis around this response is really incredible, and I want to speak more to that later. But when you're talking about the demolition, there is incredibly beautiful artwork that has been instantaneously created in these communities on plywood, on buildings. Is there any way that we can encourage property owners, building owners to salvage those, particularly those billboards? We really want to be able to preserve that artwork to the best of our capabilities. I know that there are community groups working on that, but I wanted to bring that up simply because, you know, you're talking about immediate demolition of properties and those things, and so to the extent that we can talk to property owners about salvaging those artistically created billboards, and even when, you know, some buildings may not have sustained the kinds of damages that require demolition, but eventually they will be removing those plywoods to reopen their businesses, and we want to maintain that work. We want even all of the dirty, nasty, you know, graffiti that is available, like all of that matters. So I wanted to send that message.
Madam Chair, Council Vice President, yes, that artwork is really incredible. I was just talking this morning with our Public Arts Administrator, Mary Altman, and our Public Works Director, Robin Hutchison, about this very topic. We are aware of some private efforts. I saw an email from Lake Street Council this morning with one of them described to preserve the plywood murals in particular, and there will be more to come on the what probably started out as spontaneous artwork and now has logistical challenges with how do you preserve such a thing. But I know that both our Public Works Department and our Public Arts Administrator are giving this a lot of thought. So thank you for the comment and the direction.
And I will offer myself involvement in any way that you guys think my involvement would be helpful.
Thank you so much. I'll continue on, Madam President, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So I described the first category, which is the buildings and the damage that they sustained, tragic damage they sustained. The next category that I would describe to you is the losses sustained by our businesses. And there were large businesses, and most tragically, I think, our small businesses sustained in the midst of a pandemic where the economy was already challenging, at least, sustained even more damage. So losses including loss of revenue, loss of inventory, the continuation of their business, the damage of not knowing when to start marketing again. There are lost wages to their employees. And we are starting to aggregate different data collection sources to understand the losses to these businesses, from things like sales tax information, employment information, and we are doing outreach. We have started to put together a data collection form, and we're hearing offers from many, many different organizations and private individuals. The University of Minnesota, University of St. Thomas, Small Business Development Centers, the state's Department of Employment and Economic Development, and we will do everything we can to take them up on that offer and gather information so that we understand, together with community, how to design the programs that will need to exist to address these losses to businesses. And the last one, Madam President, that I would mention is the loss of community economic wealth. And this one is, of course, the hardest to quantify. This includes the overall wealth lost to owners and workers and our residents, the damage which impacted everyone's access to goods and services, which is a bad thing for the economy, to be sure, but also a serious challenge for the affected businesses and their workers. The increased cost of living and the challenges posed by needing to travel farther and in recent days without access to transit for basic needs. And it will certainly impact market conditions, things like credit and insurance market confidence and property values, and as I've said several times now, pressures on displacement. So, Madam Chair, I am happy to answer any questions or turn it over to my colleagues who have more of this report, and I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frank. Councilmember Kano.
Okay, I hope you guys can see me. I appreciate this update from our CPED team, and I wanted to take this opportunity to highlight the community-based efforts that have been happening around the clock pretty much since last Tuesday night when the first community rally and protest was organized to fight for justice for the life of Mr. George Floyd. So since then, I think groups on Lake Street specifically, which is the region I can speak for, because that's the community I've been involved with, they've, I think put together over 265 impacted businesses and community groups on Lake Street to submit a letter to all of us, so that letter's in our inbox already. And I know it's been hard to keep the emails straight because we're getting a lot of emails right now from people all over the country. But nonetheless, that letter was sent to us, I believe yesterday, and it was also delivered to the governor's office, to state legislators, and to county officials, requesting $1 billion minimum in aid for Lake Street recovery efforts. And so I know that this number is backed up by metrics that they put together based on a lot of the things that Mr. Frank has mentioned here already, but also thinking about some of the loans that people won't be able to pay back that they had currently to establish a business on Lake Street, or that were stabilizing a business on Lake Street. Certainly the thing that worries me the most is the employees, many of them people of color, who were able to rely on the Lake Street economy as a place to have a reliable job, reliable paycheck, where their dignity could be recognized and acknowledged when other parts of the economy wouldn't take them. And so I often give the example of, while Foot Locker was targeted as a building that was burned down, which the entire block ended up burning down because it's a corporation. You could argue that Foot Locker is a corporation, and while I acknowledge that, I also want to remind folks here that every time I walked into the Foot Locker on Chicago and Lake with my kids, I was greeted by African American employees, and every time I would walk to the cell phone store on Chicago and Lake, or the three of them that existed there, it was Latino employees. And so I'm really concerned about what is going to happen to those people and those residents and those families. I hope that the state legislators can hear us out in that Lake Street community, those 265 plus business owners, organizations that we often work with, like Neighborhood Development Center, Lake Street Council, Latino Economic Development Center, CLUES, Mercado Central, They have all been organizing on the ground for days now, trying to prevent their communities from burning down and trying to also do recovery packages and advocacy in addition to the police reform work, because now everybody there is concerned about safety and what safety looks like moving forward, understanding that our safety systems right now don't work. And so I just wanted to highlight and lift up that letter and that request from that community, saying that we need at least $1 billion for Lake Street alone, much less, I'm not quite sure what the number would be citywide, and I'm hoping that our staff are really able to give us some meat on the bones for that. And I know that there's been other numbers that have been shared about what it would take for a citywide package and then perhaps a statewide package, because we know that Midway and St. Paul was also heavily impacted by some of the fires and the destruction of buildings. And lastly, I'll just end by saying that a lot of well-intentioned white folks in my ward were upset at my decision to support the National Guard coming in to protect some of those buildings. And I wanted to explain a little bit more about the fact that if you have a relationship with the brown folks on our commercial corridors, you understand that this is more than just buildings. You know that this is how people feed their kids, how people are planning to send their kids to college. You understand that traditionally, historically, culturally, trade and commerce have been a part of our communities for hundreds of years, way before capitalism became a system, dominant system. And it is a part of our DNA in so many ways to bring people together around tamales and tortillas and pan. It's not just about the physical buildings on Lake Street and trying to protect them, but it was trying to protect the history, presence of a community here who is now at threat of being completely erased. And so I don't want us to get to a place where we have a good policing system, but no communities of color to enjoy the fruits of that labor. And that's the critical juncture we're in right now, where if we don't take quick and swift action to remedy and protect the communities that have been harmed on Lake Street and in other parts of West Broadway and perhaps closer over to the 5th Precinct area down by Nicollet and Lake, that we might end up being a whiter city with a better policing system on the backs of people of color once again. So I did make a round of calls to people this morning, and some of my council members here on this call know that I'm hoping that we can introduce an ordinance to protect some of these communities. If there are emergency declarations that can be enacted either by the mayor or the governor, we need those now. We needed those yesterday. We needed those 2 days ago. And we need help. I myself am feeling very overextended with trying to not only address our policing systems, but also bottom line the work of community safety on Lake Street and advocate and organize on the recovery efforts. And it's really a lot of work. And so if there are council members on here that can lend more energy and thinking about the types of strategies the city can codify to make sure that in this vulnerable moment, our communities don't get bought out or displaced, because many of them aren't going to have the proper insurance to cover what happened. They might have a faulty insurance because they were taken advantage of. Some people might have to go into tax forfeiture or foreclosure just because of the lack of ability to sustain in this moment. So there's a lot of, I think, different themes or ways that this could happen, and we need more help in addressing that. I invite all of you to please submit ideas or propose efforts, because there's not enough hours in the day for myself and other council members who might have been impacted to really figure out how we're going to protect the diversity in our community, so that the day we do have a better policing system, those very communities are here to be a part of that future and that vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. And I'll just say a few things at this juncture in the meeting. We have about 45 minutes left before the beginning of our emergency meeting, and that it would be with no break for council members or staff. I know we have Dr. Hutchison who would like to make some presentation of what staff's been working on, as well as Dr. Lane. I also see a number of colleagues in queue. I'm going to suggest that we just have the staff finish the presentation, and then I will call on council colleagues. I also want to note that Councilmember Cano and Council Vice President Jenkins and Councilmember Cunningham have been starting discussions about formalizing policymaker group guidance on this work, this being economic and community recovery related to both COVID-19 as well as the recent events in our city. So if council members are interested in participating in that, maybe you could contact myself and Council Vice President as we think through how to formalize policymaker guidance on those next steps. So I'll turn it now to Director Hutchison and the staff team to finish up that presentation.
Good morning, Council President Bender, members of the City Council POGO Committee. I'll be very brief and break this into two parts to report on public works activities and recovery, as well as some preliminary estimates on cost of recovery for our immediate work. In the first category, we have been for the last roughly 7 days out on the street supporting our community, literally picking up the pieces with special shout outs to our street team, our bridge team, solid waste team, and fleet team in amassing the effort and the cost associated with the last 7 days, which includes items such as damage to streetlights and signals, signing and striping, scorched pavement, the damage to our streetscape, as well as restoration of our water services in the last week alone. Our costs stand almost $4 million. We'll be continuing to project that out, working closely with the Office of Emergency Management as they bring these costs into their overall work. I also want to take a moment and talk about longer term recovery as we do transition out of emergency management into long term, and say that as a public works team, we look to the community to guide our work on what needs to happen in the streets and on the streets for recovery. And we begin our work at 38th and Chicago, where we are right now trying to determine whether and how we might preserve the art expression that exists on the street. We'll be reaching out to the council members to discuss that further. We also are beginning to catalog what we have seen on our streets that has resulted from the last week of expression in order that we may understand how our public right-of-way, all 22% of it, has been used solely for this community purpose. We'll be sharing that back as we have it. And then we're also looking at some priority improvements that will support what our communities feel we should be supporting. Our efforts will be entirely focused on listening to our community and responding effectively. Thank you. That is all I have for today.
Thank you, Director. I know we are also slated to hear from IGR and Director Lane.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. Good morning, Madam President, committee members. Allison Nessie with Government Relations Representative in our Intergovernmental Relations Department. Before I dive into our legislative update around economic relief and community investment, I first want to address and confirm to you here and now that your Intergovernmental Relations team fully understands the critical importance of our work with you all in the effort to dismantle systematic racism through laws and policies. The weight of the moment demands it, and we are committed to continuing being bold and direct in our representation and advocacy for the City of Minneapolis and our residents at the state legislature and federal government. As has been shared before me, at this moment today, we do not have a specific legislative ask formulated around economic assistance, relief, and investment. As David and Robin spoke to, we do not have enough information on the specifics both in need and damage, and that damage is multi-dimensional and long-term. We are coordinating daily with CPED and other departments to make sure that IGR is clear on the assessment work progress. We also understand that specifics of rebuilding plan cannot be business as usual and must come from Black, Brown, and Indigenous leaders and businesses impacted. And Councilmember Cano, in response to the work and request you shared with David, I will follow up with you and other council members representing impacted areas so we can work together. What we do have as IGR today to share our goals and guiding principles in line with what David stated, that we will apply to the formulation of any proposed legislation that gives us flexibility to do an inclusive decision-making process. These goals and principles are: 1, to stabilize Black, Indigenous, and people of color-owned businesses in the immediate impact zones in both the short and long term. 2, policies and programs must be people-centered, specifically rooted in Black, Indigenous, and people of color's lived experiences. 3, to prevent land grabs on the backs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color-owned businesses. And 4, to create a system for people to prevent monopolies that exacerbate gentrification and displacement, and allow and support the acquisition of the land and economic spaces in their own communities. At the state level, your IGR team is in constant communication with our Minneapolis legislators as well as legislative leadership in the governor and lieutenant governor's office and appropriate state department leadership. We have been clear that flexible grant funding is of the utmost importance, but as I noted, specific plans need to be led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color business owners and community members. We have been working with leadership at the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development on assessing existing funding avenues, but are really pushing for new and unprecedented types of funding and financing options, stressing flexibility and ease of deployment. A special session is never a guarantee, but it is more than likely that one will be called a week from today, Friday, June 12th. The goal by then is to have language that can be passed and deploy funding quickly and, again, flexible and accessible for those that need it. The fiscal reality of the state is similar to the cities, so we are working with legislative department leadership on creative funding and financing tools. We will have more information on that even later today from leadership, but up to now, discussions and ideas have been fluid as the assessment evolves, but both the governor's administration and the legislature have voiced their commitments to this effort. Before I move on to a quick federal update, I want to note that today's specific update is to economic assistance, relief, and investment, but our team is working very hard on public safety reform, specifically that which has been proposed this week by the House DFL caucus, and of course the vast amount of critically important issues related to coronavirus. We know that to address all of these, we must do better and to center the Black, Indigenous, and people of color's voices and experiences in all of these areas. Last, a quick federal update for you. Our office has been in contact with Senators Klobuchar and Smith's offices and Representative Omar's office. There is strong commitment from each of them to working on a federal economic assistance, relief, and investment, but what that looks like is still in discussion, and we should have more information early next week. I am happy to follow up at any time with individual council members on this work, and I believe questions for the end. So at this time, I appreciate your time, and I will move to Barrett Lane.
Thank you. Director Lane.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Barrett Lane with the Office of Emergency Management. I was asked to give a brief update on availability of FEMA resources, and given the hour and actually the scope of the information, I will be brief. The primary vehicle for federal relief for disasters is the Federal Stafford Act. The Stafford Act is focused primarily on natural disasters, and it is somewhat ambiguous with respect to its applicability for the situation that we find ourselves in at this point in time. We have been in constant communication with the state of Minnesota, with Hennepin County, Ramsey County, and the city of St. Paul, as well as others on this issue. Right now, we are proceeding as if FEMA resources will be available, but at this point in time, that is an argument that needs to be made, and I know that the state of Minnesota is fully behind making that argument. In support of that argument, we completed the initial damage assessment that was discussed in the presentation earlier today. We looked at all 58 square miles of the city and have compiled that initial report. We are still working on those data. We will provide those data to the state in support of their work with FEMA. The State Homeland Security Emergency Management Director, Joe Kelly, has been in touch with FEMA Region 5 and will be requesting what's called a preliminary damage assessment, which is the next step in this process. Again, all in the effort of making a case for eventual FEMA and federal support. The nature, scope of that support, or whether it is going to be available at all, is still unknown at this time. But the one thing that I would just put a marker down on is that FEMA pays 75% and the local match is 25%. Traditionally, the state has assisted with that 25%. So whether or not we are looking to the state for resources, the federal government for resources, we are putting together the factual basis to make those arguments and make those claims. So more to come on that. This is a developing situation and we will continue to keep you all updated on as we go forward. Madam Chair, that's all I have.
Thank you, Director. I have a number of council members in queue to make comments or ask questions. I also, as you'll see from the email this morning, as well as the chat function, that Councilmember Gordon has a motion related to a staff direction. So in the interest of time, I guess maybe I'll recognize you, Councilmember Gordon, to maybe briefly describe that staff direction action and then go back to the council members who are in queue to speak.
Thank you very much. This is probably a relatively smaller thing, but it has to do with supporting our businesses, and it was at the request of some businesses who are asking us to do this, and I believe all my colleagues have had an opportunity, and I know that staff has throughout the city, to see the staff direction. This would direct the staff at Business Licensing Division of the Department of Community Planning and Economic Development to implement a change to the block event and special events process to allow all block event or special event organizers, if they choose, to use private security services rather than off-duty Minneapolis police officers. And the second item is asking, or I should say, directing staff of Business Licensing Division to work with the mayor's off-duty work group and provide a report to our Business Inspections and Zoning Committee no later than August 4th, 2020, with a number of licensed businesses that have specific license conditions requiring the use of off-duty Minneapolis police officers. I'm happy to take questions and don't need to spend much more time on this unless people feel the need.
Thank you, Councilmember. I know it's a little more challenging than usual to track the different layers of conversation in the chat versus our normal system, but I will do my best. I think we should just take up this action item. So I'll ask if there are any, and so Councilmember Gordon has moved the item. I'll second the item for discussion. And is there any comments or questions from council members on this? Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam President. I just want to thank Councilmember Gordon for bringing the staff direction forward. This is a huge, glaring gap in terms of, as we're talking about generally public safety and the issues of having off-duty police officers working these additional jobs, but still the city being liable for their behavior while they are on these jobs for private businesses. I think that this is just so needed. And so I will be very much so strongly in support of this and want to thank Councilmember Gordon for bringing this forward.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion on Councilmember Gordon's staff direction?
Madam President, just to be clear, this is only related to special events. Is that correct?
If I could. I believe the second part of this, it's important to pay attention to this. So this relates to some of the conditions we put on bars or event centers or those things. So it's not just potentially special events, but sometimes when we have a club or something that has problems, we have put on special licensing conditions that require them to use off-duty Minneapolis police officers. So that second item is focusing in on that issue. with the ultimate goal of allowing them other alternatives if they were to so choose, just as the first section of this is dealing with our special events and block events. Does that address your question clearly enough?
Yes,
Through the chair?
yes, Councilmember Gordon, thank you very much.
Thank you both. Any further discussion? Seeing none, clerk will call the roll on Councilmember Gordon's motion.
Councilmember Wright.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Kano.
Aye.
Schrader.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Jenkins.
Aye.
President Bender.
Aye.
There are 12 ayes.
That carries and that staff direction is adopted. So that returns us to the general discussion and comments on the staff presentation. I just want to note the time, as I'm sure you all see, is just a half hour until our emergency meeting starts. I want to note for my colleagues and the public that the temporary restraining order that we'll be taking up at the emergency meeting is now posted on the LIMS system on the city's website under the meeting agenda. So thank you to the clerk and all the staff who worked to get that ready for now. And I see Councilmember Schrader in queue, and then Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam President. I'll be very brief. I would, love to talk a lot about what we've heard from the directors and just thank them for all of their time and specifics, but I will just do a general one there. I do have a question for Director Frank. Just wanted to, you mentioned that you're going to go kind of thoughtfully into new ordinances and recognizing that will take time. I did want to ask if you've been exploring just expanding some policies we have, especially as we're looking at predatory investors coming into areas that have been hit in our city. One of the things that comes to mind is the advanced notice ordinance that we have for affordable housing. Is this something that at the very least tenants and the community as well as the city could get notice of some of these areas being sold or offers being made? And that's just one example. If you have others, that would be helpful to know.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Schrader, that is one that, yes, we have been thinking about as well as others. I think in the interest of time, why don't I follow up with you separately about what our working list is. So we want to move both quickly and inclusively. And so, yes, very much expanding what we already have is on the table. Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Council Vice President.
Thank you, Madam President. I will try to be brief as well. I want to address the last three presentations. So as has been alluded to, we will be formulating a formal economic recovery committee working group, I guess would be a more appropriate term, with myself and Councilmember Kano and Cunningham, and I've invited Councilmember Goodman to be a part of that as well, and she has agreed. So I wanted to just make that note, and certainly other council members as allowed by our statutes, maintaining our open meeting laws regulations. Then secondly, I wanted to note for IGR that, when we are developing our request, we really want to be thinking about a memorial to commemorate and memorialize the incredible community efforts that have sprung up relative to George Floyd's murder, and to lift up the name of George Floyd as really igniting a worldwide movement that could potentially lead to sweeping changes around policing and public safety throughout the country. We can only hope, but we want to make sure that we are including information about a memorial. And also something that I've been talking about since I initially, since we got sworn in January 2018, and that is a Center for Racial Healing. It is even more important that we develop this now, and we need help from the state. We need help from Hennepin County. We need help from our federal government. And to the point that folks have mentioned that they talked to our senators, I also had an opportunity to spend some time yesterday with our Congresswoman and several other Black Congressional Caucus members after the memorial service, and they are very, very interested in sending federal assistance to be able to help with this community recovering. So I wanted to mention that. And then to the Public Works Director, I just wanted to mention that yesterday I was out at the site, and thank you so much for helping to block off that site from traffic. But I was out there and I talked to a Public Works staff person. His name is Bob, and he was literally with gloves on digging out trash from an Aspen trash container that was overflowing because Aspen had not been out there to clean it yet. And that is not our staff's responsibility to take care of those private containers, but he was trying to make sure to keep a sanitary site for the protesters and the community members that were there to mourn and to grieve and to celebrate. In fact, yesterday, the life of George Floyd. And so I wanted to mention that the dedication of our staff throughout all of our departments, but particularly our Public Works, who have been able to help maintain some level of normalcy and cleanliness and sanitation in the midst of this crisis is just phenomenal. So that's the end of my comments, Madam President.
Thank you, Council Vice President. And I am going to let the Council Vice President have the last word, even if council members were willing to go through with no break to our important 12:30 meeting. I want our staff to have the chance to reset the system and do what they may need to do in the next, 10 minutes or so before they are back logged on to the next meeting. I want to note for my colleagues that the meeting that begins at 12:30, again, the items are online in the LIMS system for you and your constituents to see. And I do want to say that we've given the commissioner a commitment that we will take a vote by 1:30 p.m. on that item. So I know council members may have lengthy remarks that they want to make or questions. We've had enormous access to the commissioner and her staff over the last several days as we work through those items. So I will ask your cooperation in helping to make sure that meeting has a vote by 1:30, and then we'll have time for comments after that as well, if folks want to just explain or talk more about what's happening. And I note that Councilor Marcano wants to talk about a community process around the 3rd precinct and other community supports. I appreciate that and happy to note that. And again, we'll just be wrapping up this meeting so that our staff have a chance to do the technical things needed to support the next emergency meeting. So thank you for the beginning of what will be a long discussion, I know, and for the leadership of the council members who are stepping up as they are doing so much on the ground all night long, working 24 hours a day. Just want to see that work and highlight it. And so with that, we've concluded. I will direct the clerk to file the report that we've just had from staff. With that, we've concluded all of our business, and without objection, we stand adjourned. Thank you so much. I'll see you all in 15 minutes or fewer at the next meeting.